Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Equals. This is Max.
Welcome to Equals, everyone. This is your co-host, Naf.
Naf, how are you doing? What's going on in your world?
Really good, Max. I'm packing. I'm traveling tonight to Ethiopia, to Addis, to see my grandmother.
Oh, your granny. Wow. Okay. How old is she?
Uh, we're always debating about this, with my family. Some think she's 98 and above. I actually think she's like 101, 102.
Amazing. So, does she remember Emperor Haile Selassie?
Of course. Actually, it's interesting that you're asking that because last summer she was telling me that she was in the same car with Emperor Haile Selassie and Queen Elizabeth. I think in the 50s or 60s, Queen Elizabeth came to Ethiopia to visit. And yeah, my granny has, this clear memory that she was in the same car with the Emperor and Queen Elizabeth.
Well, I mean, who knows? Maybe she was. What do we know? We weren't there, but she sounds like an amazing lady. So, anyway, who are we interviewing today?
We have an amazing radical voice from the South, Max. We have Fadhel Kaboub with us.
Indeed, indeed. Can you tell listeners a bit about him?
Yes, so Fadel is an associate professor of economics at Denison University. He's also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has this amazing Substack called Global South Perspective. I really love it. I highly recommend his Substack.
Yes, really good. And how did you first hear about Fidel then?
So I came across him because of Ndongo Sambasila. I don't know if you remember, Max, but Nabila and I interviewed a while back. And Ndongo was suggesting, that I speak to Fadel. He was saying amazing radical voice from the South, and that he also has, these concrete solutions on how to address the inequality and climate crisis together. So really excited that we're interviewing him.
Yeah, it's a great interview. Let's get into it. Fadel, welcome to Equals. Really great to have you on. First question is really about you. So you were an academic for a long time, but much more recently you've become much more of an activist and a much more of a campaigner. Can you tell us about yourself? Tell us about your journey and why it is you've become a campaigner?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and thanks for hosting this conversation. I spent 20 years as an academic scholar, but I've always had interest in public policy, always interested in kind of solution-oriented thought processes. Surprisingly, I was never trained or interested academically in issues related to climate. But my interest in understanding what causes debt crises in developing countries eventually dragged me into the climate space.
Really great to have you, given that, especially this year, there's a lot happening on climate finance. What, in your view, is the relationship between the fight for climate breakdown and the fight for inequality?
So, when it comes to the climate crisis, it's very clear that emissions have caused this, and that there are some countries that have been responsible historically for the vast majority of them. So, there's a thing we call a carbon budget, and each country has a particular share of that carbon budget. And countries of the global north have by far exceeded their carbon budget. They've overconsumed their carbon budget, so they're in deficit. And countries of the global south, Africa in particular, have not used up their carbon budget. Africa as a continent is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. That's the equivalent of Spain alone, just to put things in context. So this carbon budget concept tells us that some countries have a climate debt. But here's the thing. Let's say I owe you $100, Max. I'm supposed to pay you $100 at the end of the month, at the end of the year. We can agree. I can give you like monthly installments. But the thing is, I have to give you $100. But here's how things work in the climate finance space, unfortunately. Instead of me giving you $100, I'm going to give you $3 and tell you exactly what to do with it. And then I feel really bad because you clearly need more climate finance. So I'm going to lend you $7 and tell you exactly what to do with those $7, kind of dictate your local policy choices and so on. And, it's a loan, but, concessional loan, low interest rate. And then you clearly need more than, that for climate finance. So I'm going to give you $10, but you really have to give me your forest for carbon credit, or what we call pollution permit. And when that means you have to displace the indigenous communities who have been the custodians of that forest for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, displace them from their land, from their ancestral land, pastoral land, and so on. And that's called climate finance. It's actually being pushed now as the biggest source of climate finance. And then I think, well, you clearly need more, but we governments in the global north, we don't really have any money. So we're going to bring in the private sector to do more of climate finance. So here's what you're going to do for me. You're going to produce green hydrogen for me, right? Not for your economy, on terms that are favorable to me. And you bring in more and more market-based solutions, all of which adds up to extraction. And I'm looking at this thing called climate finance, and I was like, wait a minute, you're supposed to give me $100. I'm not supposed to give you anything, not my forest, not my hydrogen. I'm not supposed to borrow money from you. So rethinking the climate finance conversation in terms of climate debt means that debt needs to be paid, and it should be in the form of, number one, grants, not loans. Number two, transfer of life-saving technology like renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure. Some countries can contribute with grants, others can contribute with grants and in kind, as in transferring what we call life-saving technology. And the third component of this climate debt payment is debt cancellation, right? Because the global South, Africa in particular, has been in a almost perpetual debt trap.
You make the whole climate finance business is basically a con, isn't it? It's what it feels like. I mean, the Europeans have this big Green New Deal. We've heard a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which, despite its name, is very much a climate act. Can you? I mean, you've been very much talking about a plan for Africa in particular to kind of counterbalance that. And in relation to these other big initiatives, the extent to which what the Americans are doing with their transition and Europe, is that a good thing for Africa, a bad thing? And how does Africa make its own plan?
Africa as a continent needs to have a long-term, coherent, comprehensive, strategic vision for itself on climate, on energy, on development. And every economic bloc has every right to have a vision for itself, to use its economic diplomacy and resources and incentives to nudge everybody else to where they want to see them in that future that they lay out for themselves. And the problem is that if you don't have a vision for yourself as a continent, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's long-term strategic vision. And the economic blocs that have these long-term strategic visions, as you just mentioned, they all have a vision for Africa. And unfortunately, a lot of these visions resemble the initial visions that were imposed on the African continent during colonial times, and on the global South in general. And that can be summarized in three major points. And this is the colonial history, the reality of the colonial history. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. Number two, we're supposed to be the place where the industrial output from the global north and technology is sold in our large consumer market for us to be the users of imported technology and capital equipment and all of that. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the guise of development and cooperation and job creation, all of that. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain. That's why I always say we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. I'll give you one statistic just to illustrate why that is very problematic. If you divide the world today between global north and global south, and you net out all global financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, remittances from workers, interest payment, even climate finance, even illicit financial flows, all financial transactions, the net amount, the last data point we have is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. That's money moving in the wrong direction. Now, put that number side by side with some of the climate finance numbers that we're talking about, the $100 billion that was promised about 15 years ago. Most of what was delivered was actually loans, non-concessional loans for economic entrapment, and that's called climate finance. Put that in next to the Green Climate Fund, which last time I checked after the latest replenishment has about $12 billion. And then put it side by side with the Loss and Damage Fund, which only has $700 million in it. And then put that side by side, for example, with the annual profits of the top four fossil fuel companies. You will not find a single climate fund, whether it's national, regional, or global, that can match the annual profits of the fossil fuel companies. So that is a serious problem that must be addressed if we're serious about tackling the challenges that we're dealing with.
So, Fadel, I'm always struggling trying to find the practical solution in terms of we know that climate finance is needed for climate action. Yeah, we always say that. Now you're talking about decolonizing to decarbonize and outlining the issues really, really well. For Africa, for instance, even the African Union has come up with this industrial strategy on how to revolutionize Africa's mineral-based industrialization. Africa's path for a just transition, but that's going to require money, yeah. And where's that money going to come from? Are we not going back to the global north for this? Um, so how do we address these issues, or the carbon offset example that you gave? A lot of countries, when we say to them in Africa, for instance, you cannot support carbon offset, it's not good for the climate, but it's also not good for you because you're going to displace your communities. This is going to affect food production within your own country. But these countries come back to us saying they need the money. Um, for climate action, whether it's for adaptation or even to facilitate this transition. So, how do we overcome those issues, Fadel?
So when you look at why countries in Africa are not able to invest in strategic priorities, health, education, climate action, it's because they don't have a fiscal policy space, because the external debt basically consumes quite a bit of their export revenues. And, it's not unusual to find that countries in Africa spend 50% sometimes of their export revenues servicing the debt, just paying interest on external debt. So when you do that, there's really very little fiscal policy space left for priorities, let alone for climate action. So then the question becomes, what's the source of this external debt? And you start digging, you realize it's food imports, energy imports, and manufacturing deficits. And I'll explain each very briefly. When I say food imports, uh, Africa today imports 85% of its food. It's not by accident, it's by design, because less than 100 years ago, Africa used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. Today, we are in a situation where we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. Number two, it's energy deficits. And here I include our biggest oil exporters in Africa, like Nigeria, right? Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline. Our second largest oil exporter, Angola, imports 80% of its fuel. And this is, again, not by accident, by design, because you look at the classic economic entrapment playbook of fossil fuel companies in Africa. It's designed to go after the biggest oil producers, making them energy poor, energy insecure, and in debt. And then finally, that is the type of industrialization that we were allowed to have in Africa. And I use my words carefully here, that we're allowed to have, is the type where you have to import the machines, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low cost labor, We have to import the fuel to power the factories, and we even have to import the packaging in some cases. So we end up with a manufacturing base that produces low value added content for exports, and what we import is high value added content. So with that kind of structure, you can double, triple, quadruple your export. You're still locked at the bottom of the value chain. But here's how this adds up. So you have food deficits, energy deficits, manufacturing deficits. These are core component of any economy. So you have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade. And there's a very simple economic concept here that most people are familiar with, which is when a country has a trade deficit, its currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar, to the euro, to the British pound. And with a weaker currency, anything I need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, it's going to cost me more in real terms. So our countries end up importing inflation when they import food and fuel and medicine, which means you have inflation pressure points in the most sensitive areas of your economy. And if you don't do anything about that important inflation, you're going to have social unrest, political unrest. So, by design, our governments immediately intervene with band-aid solutions to protect the most vulnerable people from food inflation and fuel price inflation and so on. So, what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel to the extent we can, and we do something else, which is we ask our central bankers to do their best to stabilize the exchange rate, to defend the exchange rate. And central banks have a very simple band-aid solution to do that. They say, well, we need to borrow more dollars, more euros. And that starts to drive you deeper into the debt trap. And of course, once you have external debt, it's the lenders who impose conditionalities and dictate your economic policy choices, and the lenders are interested in getting paid. So they force you to prioritize economic activity that will generate dollar revenues. And that starts to accelerate extractivism and, starts to kind of distract you from investing in the building blocks of development and prosperity, health, education, infrastructure, and of course, climate, policy becomes an impossible, priority to achieve. And there we go to the external sources of climate finance, which is when governments say, well, we don't have any options. The global north is not giving grants. The global north is not paying its climate debt. The global north is not transferring life-saving technology. The only thing the global north is providing is pollution permits, these financial crumbs to take over our forests to offset emissions from the global north. And a lot of this, so-called climate finance that comes under the label of carbon markets or carbon credits, which we call pollution permits, is actually not even used for climate action. A lot of that cash that comes in is often used very quickly to service the debt. If we're serious about climate action, that needs to be front and center of this conversation.
Do you think? I mean, it is the case at the moment that there's a clear link between economic growth and carbon emissions, and that the kind of myth of decoupling is still largely a myth. So is it not in the interests of the global north that Africa doesn't develop? Because if Africa does, along similar paths, then there'll be even more of the carbon budget sucked up. I mean, to put it more bluntly, isn't it more in their interest that Africa stays poor? And I wonder whether that feeds into some of this politics on top of the colonization and the historical extraction. When you add the climate element, you've got a kind of, there's another reason to kind of stop development in the global south, if that makes sense.
No, I completely understand where that fear of development in Africa comes from a climate perspective. And it's based on the assumption that Africa and the global south will develop and engage in the level of consumerism that is available in the global north. And that is a reasonable assumption because unfortunately this is the culture we live in. But that's not the just transition framework we want to see. And it's not the only path to development. Imagine for a moment, and this is an assumption, imagine for a moment you have a block of global south countries, say 30, 40 countries, that really understand the structural traps that must be undone if we're going to have a just transition and true development and kind of repositioning the global south away from the bottom of the global value chain. That block of countries has complementarity of resources and capabilities, all the strategic minerals needed, but needs access to this life-saving technology that's been systematically denied by the global north. Imagine that block for a moment designing its actual industrial policy with, on its own terms, under, much more favorable terms for labor, for mining communities, and all the things that, we want to see in the just transition movement. So that is done. And now that bloc going as a united front to a country like China that actually has the entire value chain and the technology for manufacturing solar panels and offering what I would call the bargain of the century to a country like China, saying, look, if you transfer technology to replicate the entire value chain in this block of global south countries on our terms, in 10 years, you get to double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 years, you get to double your geopolitical weight globally. And in 10 years, you essentially secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody is panicking about. Now, why would China not accept that bargain? And just triggering the process of this bargain, you don't actually have to finish it, immediately gives that bloc a second bargaining chip to go to, say, Germany and say, look, we offer you the same deal if you transfer wind turbine technology manufactured and deployed in the global south on our terms, not neocolonial terms. And if Germany says, no, we don't do joint ventures, we don't do transfer of technology, and say, okay, let's try Japan. If Japan says no, we don't do that either, say, okay, we'll go back to China. They have the same technology. We'll let them triple their economic footprint and geopolitical footprint. And of course, that immediately puts you in a much stronger position to force the transfer of technology on reasonable terms. And all of a sudden, you reposition that global south block of countries at the center of a geopolitical and international economic order, not at the bottom, not to dominate and abuse the system, but to become sort of the arbiter of a new multipolar, decentralized, geopolitically decentralized world that is not only, the right economic order for a just transition for everybody, because now that block is using its critical minerals, so it's actually forcing everybody else to think about, well, how can we transition and decarbonize with fewer critical minerals, which means you have to rethink consumerism and planned obsolescence, and you have to invest in material science research, all the things that we want to see under a coherent degrowth framework.
Fadel, despite all the challenges that you've outlined, and we have been discussing so many, from trade to financial systems to economic entrapment by design, what gives you hope in the ongoing fight for equal transformation?
So you know what the Wall Street guys say about hope? They say hope is a crappy hedge, and you have to have like concrete, strategies that can show you that a better world is actually within reach. And then that allows you to identify the obstacles, who's really standing in the way, what is the narrative they use, what are the false solutions they use, what are the dangerous distractions they use, and go after them and call them out. And that is part of the work that many of us in the global south and think tanks and civil society organizations across the continent, across the global south, are actively uniting and organizing in a kind of movement of movement type of thing, because all of us are sort of experts in our little silos or semi silos. So we need to coordinate our interventions and our problem identification. And that means me and my little silo, let's say I'm an expert on debt issues. I need to know enough to be dangerous when it comes to food issues, when it comes to human rights issues, when it comes to um, energy and climate issues. And that's not my expertise, but I know colleagues and allies who are really experts in that space, but debt is not their expertise. So coordinating all of our efforts so that each one of us is alert enough so that we have that collective push towards that transformation, which means if I'm working in the climate space and I identify a red flag, a dangerous distraction, I coordinate with my colleagues in the food sovereignty space and the energy sovereignty space and the human rights space so that we realize that this is part of the distraction, part of the entrapment, and we collectively coordinate intervention to call it out. And that means empowering ourselves, that is, educating, mobilizing, organizing, but then as civil society groups and think tanks and experts, then we play the support role to global south states, to global south climate negotiators, trade negotiators, to provide the alternative ideas, the alternative resource, the alternative policy briefs, because they're often overwhelmed with expert opinions and policy briefs from the global north, providing the framing that the global north wants to impose in those conversations. So that's the work that is being done, and that is super exciting, and you can see its effectiveness when our climate negotiators are listening to African experts, global South experts with those policy briefs. They say, we haven't seen this before because we thought we've done our research, but all the research has been, coming from global North think tanks. So that's what gives me hope that we actually, when we organize and mobilize and do this type of work, we see results. So that's what gives me hope.
Thanks, Fadhel. An amazing interview. And I certainly feel hopeful at the end of all of that. I don't know about you, Naf.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Fadel.
Wow, what a great interview. So, Naf, what was your initial reflections on listening to all that?
I really love how he described, the importance of decolonizing our global system before we start decarbonizing, because it started making me think, Max, we are trapped. When I say we, especially, people from the global south, countries in the global south, we are trapped in poverty, not by accident, but by design. Yeah. As Fadel said, the colonial system is still in place. Resources from minerals to energy to labor, even finance are flowing from the south to the north. And this is happening by design. It's not happening by accident. So I really love that reflection. We need to decolonize to decarbonize. And I think that's where we need to continue, fighting for, I think, in the foreseeable future, Max.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. I think the idea that the global north is the debtor and not the creditor is such a powerful and important image that it isn't properly understood. I'd say if I had any reflection on this and also the interview with Ndongo and others, is I love the idea that he put forward of a group of countries in the global south coming together and playing off the different global power blocks against each other to get new technology to make their way in the world. And that was really inspiring. But I worry about, that there just aren't that many progressive leaders in the global south at the moment. And, it's not like it was at the time of African independence where you had so many famous progressive thinkers leading countries. And I don't know, maybe I'm being too pessimistic. What do you think?
I share your concern, Max, but that said, I think we can really be optimistic. Like, take Senegal, for instance. The president, he's a young, progressive, working class leader. And he came through to power through the support of, like this massive grassroots movement of Senegalese youth. Of course, he will have an uphill battle with France, to decolonize the country. But that gives me hope, and I'm sure we'll continue to see leaders like him coming up in Africa. So I think we can be more optimistic.
I hope so, and I certainly think with this whole new generation of progressive thinkers, like Fadhel, like Ndongo, like so many others, kind of reviving these important ideas around sovereignty, industrial policy, and the global south finding its own way in the world. That's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? So I mean, that is definitely very positive.
Exactly, Max. To be honest, what helps me keep going is that we have these amazing and inspiring thinkers. So I feel like, we're building a movement, that we're part of a movement. And I feel like we're going the right direction.
Oh, that's a lovely way to finish. Now, I agree. And we're so lucky that on Equals we get to talk to these amazing people. So everyone, keep listening to Equals, keep discovering these new thinkers, and do recommend if there's anyone you think we should be interviewing, anyone we should be showcasing their ideas, please just get in touch and let us know. So yeah, brilliant.
Yes, hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please get in touch with us on Twitter or X. Give us good review. Share this with your friends and family. And thanks everyone. Until next time.
Until next time, thank you everyone.